The moment I revealed I still owned our family's lakeside cabin, after being told I wasn't welcome at my son's wedding, his fiancée's champagne glass shattered on their marble floor. My name is Eleanor Winters, and for 45 years, I had quietly preserved our family's legacy property while my children believed it had been lost in my divorce settlement years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This photograph was taken almost 40 years ago. Me at 25, standing with my young son Michael, just 4 years old, outside our family's lakeside cabin in Pine Ridge. We were celebrating the last summer vacation before my divorce would be finalized. The cabin had been in my family for 3 generations, a place where I'd spent every childhood summer, and where I'd hoped my children and grandchildren would create their own memories. The worry in my eyes contrasts with the carefree smile on Michael's face. He was too young to understand that our family was about to change forever. My father built that cabin with his own hands in 1952, pouring his life savings and countless weekends into creating something that would outlast him. Eleanor, he told me while teaching me to fish off the dock, appearances can be deceiving, but ownership is truth. Never surrender what matters most, even when others think you have nothing left. That wisdom would prove prophetic decades later in ways neither of us could have imagined. I married young to Richard Winters, a charming corporate lawyer with impressive credentials and family connections. Our wedding was featured in the local society pages, the schoolteacher daughter of a construction foreman marrying into one of the city's established families. By the time our son turned 3, Richard's career had taken off, bringing wealth but also long absences and growing distance between us. "It's just one dinner, Eleanor," became his standard explanation for missed family moments. Eventually, those dinners included Stephanie, a junior partner at his firm. When I discovered their affair, the divorce that followed was bitter and public. Richard's powerful family used every legal advantage to minimize what I would receive in the settlement. The cabin is non-negotiable, Richard's attorney declared during mediation. The property was purchased during the marriage and is a significant asset that must be liquidated and divided. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never lost a case against someone of my modest means. What no one knew then, what would remain my carefully guarded secret for decades, was that I had already secured the one thing that mattered most to me. 3 months before filing for divorce, sensing the marriage was beyond repair, I had quietly transferred ownership of the lakeside property to a small private trust established in my maiden name. The legal paperwork showed that the property had been sold to satisfy other debts, when in reality, I had preserved it beyond Richard's reach. My college roommate Sarah, now an estate attorney, had helped create the arrangement. "This isn't about deception, Eleanor," she assured me when I expressed doubts. "It's about protecting your family's legacy from someone who never truly valued it." "I'm sorry about the cabin, Eleanor," Richard said with manufactured sympathy after the divorce was finalized. "Some developer will probably tear it down anyway." I nodded silently, accepting his condolences for a loss that hadn't actually occurred, knowing that sometimes silence protects what matters most. In the difficult years that followed, I created a life for Michael and myself in a small apartment across town. I returned to teaching high school English, a career I had abandoned during my marriage at Richard's insistence. Money was tight, but we managed. The other teachers marveled at how I could stretch a modest salary, never knowing that a significant portion went toward property taxes and maintenance for a cabin they believed had been lost in my divorce. What my son never knew was that every summer while he visited his father's new family in Europe, I would spend 2 precious weeks at our family cabin, maintaining it quietly and preserving it for a future I hoped would one day include grandchildren, building sandcastles on the same shore where I had played as a child. "Mom, why don't we ever go to the lake anymore?" 10-year-old Michael asked once, remembering fragments of those early summers. "That's gone now, sweetheart," I replied, the half-truth bitter on my tongue. But we'll make new memories together. I justified the deception by promising myself that one day, when he was older and could understand, I would reveal everything and pass the cabin to him as my father had intended. As Michael grew older, he gradually absorbed his father's values and worldview. The summer visits to Europe became semester abroad programs, and eventually an international business degree funded by Richard's family connections. During his college years, our phone conversations grew shorter and less frequent. When he did visit, he often glanced around my modest home with a mixture of embarrassment and pity. "You could do better than this, Mom," he once suggested after getting his first finance job. "I know some excellent financial advisors who could help you maximize your teacher's pension." The irony of his concern about my financial situation while I was secretly maintaining a valuable lakeside property was something I kept to myself, smiling and thanking him for his concern. I watched with a mixture of pride and concern as my son transformed from the curious, warm-hearted boy who had once collected pine cones at our cabin into a polished young professional who measured success in acquisitions and appearances. His girlfriend-turned-fiancée, Vanessa, accelerated this transformation. Coming from a family similar to Richard's, she viewed my teaching career and modest lifestyle as charming but ultimately limited. "Michael tells me you were quite the hostess. In your day," she commented during our first meeting, as though my life of substance and service existed only in some distant past. But I never could have anticipated how completely these values would come between us, or how the cabin I had secretly preserved would eventually become the centerpiece of a family confrontation that would change everything. The first real indication that Michael's fiancée viewed me as an inconvenience rather than family came during their engagement party at Richard's expansive lakefront estate, ironically just 20 miles down the shoreline from our family cabin. The invitation arrived on heavy cardstock, addressed formally to Mrs. Eleanor Winters, with a handwritten note from Vanessa. "We're keeping it intimate and sophisticated. No need to bring anything but yourself." The evening of the party, I wore a simple blue dress I'd purchased for the school's recent retirement ceremony, accessorized with my mother's pearl necklace, modest but appropriate. When I arrived at the sprawling mansion with its manicured grounds and valet parking, I immediately felt the distinction between my world and the one my son now inhabited. "Mom, you made it," Michael greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek in the soaring marble foyer. His eyes darted over my outfit with a flicker of assessment before adding, "Vanessa's parents and their circle are by the main bar. Maybe you'd, be more comfortable on the garden terrace where it's quieter." This subtle redirection wasn't new. Over the 3 years of their relationship, I'd grown accustomed to being gently guided away from Vanessa's social circle, sophisticated international, travelers and finance professionals who viewed my career in public education with polite disinterest. What was new was Michael's growing comfort with this arrangement. Later that evening, I overheard my son speaking to an elegant older couple near the champagne fountain that dominated the center of the room. "Eleanor?" "Yes, my mother dedicated her life to teaching," he was explaining with the same tone he might use to describe an exotic but ultimately impractical lifestyle choice. "She's truly one of the unsung heroes, even if her world has been somewhat limited." "How admirable that she found fulfillment in such modest work," the woman replied, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she patted Michael's arm. "And how fortunate she must feel to see you achieve so much more." "We all follow different paths," Michael responded smoothly, raising his glass. "I'm just grateful I can ensure her comfort now that she's retired." The irony struck me deeply. This son who believed he needed to ensure my financial security had no idea that I owned a property worth more than his annual salary, maintained quietly through decades of careful planning and sacrifice. But the greater pain was hearing him describe my chosen profession, my deliberate life of service and substance, as though it were a charming limitation rather than a purposeful choice. These moments multiplied in the months that followed the engagement. Michael and Vanessa purchased a luxury condominium in the city's most exclusive high-rise, and my invitations to visit became increasingly rare and choreographed. When I did visit, Vanessa would make subtle remarks about my quaint perspectives or traditional tastes, each comment carrying the implication that I was a relic from another era, rather than a woman with her own valid viewpoint. "Michael mentions you never traveled much," she observed during one such visit, as we sat in their immaculate living room with its carefully curated art and spectacular city views. "We're planning to spend at least a month abroad every year. I can't imagine being so rooted." I smiled politely, thinking of the quiet mornings I'd spent watching mist rise off the lake at our cabin, the spectacular autumn colors reflected in those waters, the peace that comes from deeply knowing one beloved place. "Different kinds of richness, I suppose," was all I said, unwilling to defend my choices to someone uninterested in understanding them. My retiring from teaching after 32 years coincided with their wedding planning, and the intersection of these two significant life events revealed how completely Michael had adopted his father's value system. At my modest retirement gathering in the high school library, surrounded by colleagues and former students whose lives I had touched, Michael arrived late and left early, clearly uncomfortable in a setting so removed from the prestigious circles he now inhabited. "You could do so much more now, Mom," he suggested as we walked to the parking lot afterward. "Travel, take some courses at the community college, maybe even move to a nicer apartment in a better area." "I'm content with my life as it is," I replied. "Not everyone needs external validation to feel fulfilled." He frowned slightly, missing the gentle rebuke in my words. "It's not about validation, it's about quality of life. Dad mentioned he could help you with some investments if you're worried about your pension." The mention of Richard's offered help after decades of absence in our lives stung more than Michael could know. After the divorce, his father had consistently paid the required child support, but had otherwise remained distant, materializing primarily for graduations and other milestone events, where his presence would be noted by his social circle. That Michael now viewed his father as a financial authority to guide me felt like a particular betrayal. What my son couldn't understand, what I had never shared with him, was that through those 32 years of teaching, I had managed not only to maintain our secret family cabin, but had also built a modest but secure financial foundation. My pension, combined with careful investments guided by other teachers who had similar resourcefulness, provided everything I needed for the life I had chosen. The wedding planning brought these differences into sharper focus. Michael and Vanessa had selected an exclusive international resort for their ceremony, a location that would require significant travel expenses for me on my teacher's pension. When I gently inquired about the arrangements, suggesting a local celebration might allow more family to attend, the response was immediate and revealing. "This is about what Vanessa and I want for our special day," Michael explained, his tone suggesting I was being unreasonable. "Dad has already chartered a private jet for his side of the family." I nodded and assured him I would make it work, though the implied competition with Richard's extravagance was clear. What Michael didn't know was that I had already decided to use some of my carefully saved funds to attend his wedding with dignity, viewing it as an investment in our future relationship rather than an extravagance. 3 months before the wedding, Vanessa invited me to lunch at an upscale restaurant downtown, our first one-on-one meeting without Michael present. The invitation itself was unusual enough to put me on alert. "Eleanor," she began after the waiter had taken our orders, her voice carrying the practiced diplomacy of someone delivering a prepared speech. "I wanted to talk to you about the wedding arrangements." "Of course," I replied, maintaining a pleasant expression. "I've booked my flights and accommodations. Everything is set." "That's actually what I wanted to discuss." She toyed with her water glass, not quite meeting my eyes. "Michael and I have been finalizing the guest list, and we've realized that with his father bringing his extended family and business associates, and with my family's connections, The event has grown considerably in scope. I waited, sensing the real purpose of this meeting was yet to come. The thing is, she continued, her voice taking on a note of rehearsed concern, we're creating a very specific aesthetic for the weekend. The resort has a certain exclusivity that we're trying to maintain. We're concerned that you might feel uncomfortable among so many high-profile guests. I've attended many types of events in my life, Vanessa, I replied evenly. I'm quite capable of conducting myself appropriately in any setting. She offered a tight smile. Of course you are. That's not what I meant. She paused again. It's just that Michael's father is hosting a significant number of business connections who might be important to Michael's future. The dynamic could be complicated with you there, given the history. The real message became clear. My presence at my own son's wedding was seen as an inconvenience, a potential embarrassment, a complication to the image they wished to project. Are you suggesting I shouldn't attend my son's wedding? I asked directly, my voice calm despite the hurt blooming in my chest. Not at all, she replied quickly, though her eyes told a different story. We're just suggesting that perhaps you might be more comfortable celebrating with us when we return, in a more intimate setting. We could have a special dinner, just the three of us. The diplomatic language couldn't disguise what was happening. I was being uninvited from my only child's wedding. I see, I said finally, my mind already racing ahead to decisions that would need to be made. And does Michael share this perspective? Her hesitation told me everything. He understands the complexities of the situation. It was actually his father who pointed out how awkward the seating arrangements might be, and Michael agreed it might be best for everyone this way. In that moment, sitting across from this woman who would soon be my daughter-in-law, I realized that the cabin I had preserved through decades of sacrifice had taken on a new significance. What had begun as an effort to maintain a family legacy had now become a symbol of something more personal. My refusal to be erased from my own family's story. Please let Michael know I'd like to speak with him directly about this, I said as I gathered my purse to leave, the lunch barely touched. Some conversations shouldn't happen through intermediaries. As I drove home, a plan began to form. One that would force my son to confront not just my rightful place in his life, but the values he had abandoned in his pursuit of status and acceptance in a world that measured worth by appearance rather than substance. The cabin that had remained my secret for 40 years was about to become the centerpiece of a long-overdue reckoning. The day after my lunch with Vanessa, I began what I privately termed my family recovery plan. Despite the hurt and anger churning, inside me, I felt a strange clarity of purpose. If my son and his fiancée believed they could simply write me out of his most important day, based on social appearances and Richard's comfort, then it was time to reconsider what would happen to the family legacy I had preserved for decades. My first call was to Sarah Thompson, my college roommate who had helped establish the private trust for the cabin 40 years earlier. Now a senior partner at her law firm specializing in estate planning, Sarah had maintained the legal structure of the trust through the decades, ensuring it remained protected and private. This is unexpected, she said when I explained the situation during our meeting in her downtown office. The space, with its leather-bound books and discreet wealth, reminded me of how different our professional paths had been, though our friendship had endured. You've maintained that trust specifically to pass the cabin to Michael someday. Are you certain you want to change that now? I'm not certain of anything yet, I admitted, smoothing my skirt as I gathered my thoughts. But I need to understand my options. If my son doesn't want me at his wedding, perhaps he doesn't want the family legacy either. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Legally, your position is straightforward. The property has remained in the trust with you as the sole beneficiary and trustee. You have complete authority to determine its future. She paused, studying me with the insight of decades of friendship. But this isn't really about legal options, is it, Eleanor? This is about something deeper. It's about recognition, I said, after a moment. Not just of my legal rights to the property, but of my place in my son's life. If I'm not important enough to include in his wedding, why should he benefit from the sacrifices I've made to preserve something for his future? What exactly do you want to know? Sarah asked, her tone shifting to professional efficiency. First, I need to understand what Michael knows or believes about the cabin. Has Richard ever mentioned it over the years? Does Michael have any inkling that it still exists in our family? The questions had gnawed at me through a sleepless night. That would require some discreet investigation, Sarah noted. I can make inquiries through channels that won't raise suspicions. Second, I continued, I need to know my options for the property itself. Can I sell it? Donate it? What would those processes look like? Sarah made notes as we outlined a strategy. By the end of our meeting, she had agreed to conduct a quiet investigation into what Michael might know about the cabin, while I would visit the property to assess its current condition and value. 3 days later, I made the 2-hour drive to Pine Ridge. Though I visited yearly for maintenance, this trip felt different, weighted with purpose and the possibility of goodbye. The spring afternoon was perfect, sunlight dappling through pine trees as I turned onto the familiar gravel road. The cabin sat as it always had, its weathered cedar siding and green shutters a testament to my father's craftsmanship and my decades of care. Inside, everything remained as I had left it the previous summer. The handmade quilts folded neatly on beds, my father's fishing gear still hanging on the porch, photo albums documenting 4 generations of family gatherings carefully, preserved on bookshelves. I walked through each room, cataloging memories. Michael learning to swim off the dock at age 6. My father teaching me to make pancakes on the cast-iron stove. My mother's gentle voice reading poems on rainy afternoons. This wasn't just property. It was the physical embodiment of our family's history. The thought of strangers owning it created a physical ache in my chest. Yet the thought of gifting it to a son who didn't value my place in his life seemed equally painful. I spent the night at the cabin, sitting on the dock as stars reflected on the still lake, considering options I had never imagined would be necessary. By morning, I had reached a tentative decision, one that would require confirmation from Sarah's investigation. A week later, Sarah called with her findings. I've spoken with several sources, including Richard's former law partner who handled some of his estate planning, she explained. It appears Richard has maintained the narrative that the cabin was sold during your divorce. He's mentioned it occasionally to Michael, usually as an example of assets that needed to be liquidated during the settlement. So Michael believes it's long gone, I confirmed, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Yes, Sarah continued, but there's more. According to my source, Michael and Vanessa have been looking at property in Pine Ridge for the past 6 months. Apparently, Richard mentioned that the old family cabin site would be coming up for sale soon, and he thought it would make an appropriate wedding gift if they could reclaim it for the family. The implications struck me immediately. Richard knows I still own the cabin? It seems likely, Sarah confirmed. Property records are public, though the trust structure obscures the connection to you. Someone with Richard's resources and legal connections could have discovered it. The timing suggests he may be planning to tell Michael after the wedding, presenting himself as the one who recovered the family property. The audacity was breathtaking. After 40 years, Richard had discovered my secret and was planning to use it for his own glory, recasting himself as the preserver of family legacy rather than the man who had tried to strip it away. There's one more thing, Sarah added hesitantly. According to my source, Vanessa has been explicit about her plans for the property if they acquire it. She intends to tear down the existing cabin and build a modern lake house more suitable for entertaining Richard's business associates. The final piece clicked into place. Not only was I being excluded from my son's wedding, but the family legacy I had preserved through decades of sacrifice was to be demolished and replaced with a showcase for the very values that had destroyed my marriage. "Thank you, Sarah," I said, my resolve hardening. "This clarifies exactly what needs to be done." Over the next 2 weeks, I methodically prepared for a confrontation I had never wanted but could no longer avoid. First, I gathered documentation proving my continuous ownership of the cabin, trust documents, tax records, maintenance receipts spanning decades. Then I collected photographs chronicling my regular visits to the property, showing my careful preservation of every aspect my father had created. Most importantly, I prepared myself emotionally for what would likely be a painful reset of my relationship with my only child. The evidence suggested a level of calculation that couldn't be explained away as a simple misunderstanding. Michael had not only agreed to exclude me from his wedding, but was apparently planning to profit from Richard's discovery of property he believed had been lost to our family decades ago. The final element of my preparation was the most difficult. Working with Sarah, I drafted documents that would remove Michael as the eventual beneficiary of the trust. Instead, I established provisions to donate the property to the Pine Ridge Environmental Conservancy upon my death, ensuring it would be preserved in its natural state rather than developed. The irrevocable nature of these documents meant that once signed, this decision could not be undone, a finality that weighed heavily as I considered the implications. "Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" Sarah asked as she slid the papers across her desk. Once executed, these documents permanently changed the succession plan for the property. I hesitated, pen poised above the signature line. "I've spent 40 years preserving this cabin for a son who now finds me too embarrassing to include in his wedding," I said finally. "I need him to understand that family legacy isn't something you can dismiss when inconvenient and reclaim when advantageous. And if he reacts with genuine remorse, if this serves as the wake-up call you hope it might be?" I considered this possibility, which represented my deepest hope, that confronting these truths might somehow reclaim the son I had raised before Richard's values had reshaped him. "Let's add a contingency clause," I decided. "The donation doesn't become irrevocable until either my death or 1 year from the date of notification to Michael, whichever comes later. That gives him time to demonstrate whether his values can still align with what this property represents." Sarah nodded approvingly as she made the notation. A door left slightly open. Wise as always, Eleanor. The following weekend, Michael called to invite me to dinner at his condominium, a rare occurrence that immediately raised my suspicions, given the recent conversation with Vanessa. His voice carried the forced casualness of someone with a prepared agenda. "Just a small gathering." "With Vanessa and me," he explained. "We have some wedding updates to discuss with you." "How thoughtful," I replied, matching his light tone while suspecting the updates would formalize my exclusion from the event. "Saturday at 7 works perfectly for me." This dinner would provide the setting for a confrontation that neither Michael nor Vanessa could possibly anticipate. As I prepared for the evening, selecting a simple but elegant outfit and gathering the documentation I would need, I felt a strange calm despite the emotional magnitude of what was to come. In my purse, I placed 3 items: the formal notification of changes to the trust beneficiary, recent photographs of the cabin showing my continued maintenance, and most significantly, the deed proving my uninterrupted ownership across 4 decades. These papers represented not just legal ownership of property, but the revelation of a truth I had protected longer than my son had been alive. Saturday evening arrived with perfect spring weather, the kind that had always made the lake at Pine Ridge shimmer like polished glass. As I drove to Michael's condominium in the exclusive River Point Tower, I rehearsed what I would say when the moment came. Not accusations or recriminations, but simple truths that had remained unspoken for too long. When Michael greeted me at the door with a kiss that barely grazed my cheek, I noticed immediately that the dining table was set for 3 and a bottle of expensive champagne chilled in a silver bucket. Whatever wedding updates they planned to share apparently warranted celebration. Perhaps the formalization of my exclusion had been deemed worthy of toasting. "Mom, you look nice," Michael commented, his eyes briefly assessing my simple navy dress and pearl earrings. The subtle surprise in his tone suggested he had expected less, another small indication of how completely he had misunderstood who I was and what I valued. "Thank you," I replied with a warm smile that revealed nothing of my purpose. "I'm looking forward to hearing your wedding updates." As I took the seat offered at their glass dining table with its spectacular city view, I couldn't help but think of the rough-hewn wooden table at the cabin where 4 generations of our family had gathered. The contrast between these settings, one designed to impress visitors, the other to nurture connection, seemed suddenly to represent everything that had gone wrong between my son and me. Vanessa appeared from the kitchen, carrying an artfully arranged platter of appetizers that looked more decorative than substantial. "Eleanor, so glad you could join us," she said with practiced charm that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We have some exciting developments to share about the wedding. Plans." As she poured champagne into delicate flutes, I prepared myself for the conversation that would change everything between us. The cabin I had protected for 40 years was about to emerge from the shadows, forcing a long overdue reckoning with the values that truly mattered in creating a legacy worth preserving. "A toast," Michael declared, raising his champagne flute as we settled at the dining table with its panoramic view of the city lights below. "To new beginnings and family traditions." The irony of his chosen words was not lost on me as I gently touched my glass to theirs. Vanessa's smile remained fixed as she took a delicate sip, her eyes already gleaming with the news they were clearly eager to share. "Mom," Michael began, setting down his glass with a practiced precision that reminded me painfully of Richard. "We wanted to talk to you about some adjustments to our wedding plans." I nodded encouragingly, allowing them to proceed with the script. They had obviously prepared. My own revelation could wait until they had fully committed to theirs. "As you know, the resort in Santorini is exclusive and intimate," he continued. "We've had to make some difficult decisions about the guest list to accommodate key business associates of Dad's who can open doors for my career." Vanessa leaned forward, her expression a studied blend of concern and determination. "What Michael is trying to say, Eleanor, is that we've had to reconsider some of the arrangements. The dynamics with Richard's family and business connections create certain complexities." "You're uninviting me to the wedding," I stated calmly, deciding to spare them the elaborate justifications they had prepared. "Vanessa already explained this at lunch last week." Michael's expression flickered with surprise before settling into something between embarrassment and relief. "It's not uninviting, Mom. It's recognizing that the situation might be uncomfortable for everyone. We're thinking of your comfort, too." "My comfort," I repeated softly. "Exactly," Vanessa interjected, apparently missing the skepticism in my tone. "Dad has been working on something special. A surprise, really. We weren't supposed to tell you yet, but under the circumstances." He glanced at Vanessa, who nodded encouragingly. "Dad has located our old family cabin at Pine Ridge," he announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of delivering remarkable news. "The one that was sold during your divorce. He's negotiating to buy it back as our wedding gift. Isn't that incredible? We're planning to rebuild it as a modern lake house where we can create new family memories." "Tear it down and rebuild," Vanessa clarified, her excitement evident. "The existing structure is charming but dated. We're working with an architect who specializes in luxury lake properties." I took a slow sip of champagne, using those seconds to compose myself before responding. The audacity of their plan, presented as a gift to me when they were literally replacing everything my father had built, was breathtaking. That's certainly unexpected, I managed, placing my glass carefully on the table. May I ask when? Richard discovered this property was available? Michael looked momentarily confused by my focus on this detail. A few months ago, I think. He has connections in real estate who keep an eye out for opportunities. Why does that matter? It's just interesting timing, I observed. And Richard is certain this is the same property? The original family cabin? Absolutely, Michael confirmed. He showed me the listing photos. It looks exactly like I remember from when I was little, just more weathered. The stone fireplace, the green shutters. It's definitely our old place. The interior needs to be completely gutted, of course, Vanessa added with a dismissive wave. But the location is perfect. Private waterfront, mature trees. Once we replace the cabin with something more suitable, it will be incredible. I nodded. Thoughtfully, my hand moving to my purse where the documents waited. And this generous gift? This is meant as a consolation for not attending your wedding? Michael had the grace to look uncomfortable. That's not how I'd put it, Mom. It's about creating something positive, focusing on the future instead of my presence at my only child's wedding, I completed for him. An awkward silence fell over the table. Vanessa busied herself, rearranging an already perfect place setting, while Michael struggled visibly with how to proceed. Mom? He finally said, his tone shifting to the patient voice one might use with a difficult child. We're trying to make the best of a complicated situation. Dad's extended family will be there, his business associates, Vanessa's family connections, people who are important to our future. The potential for awkwardness is significant. More significant than the absence of your mother, I noted. Not as a question, but as a simple statement of their apparent priorities. That's not fair, Michael protested, a flash of the boy I had, raised briefly visible beneath the polished exterior. We're offering an alternative that honors family legacy while avoiding social complications. The moment had arrived. I reached for my purse and removed the envelope containing the cabin documentation, placing it on the table between us. Before we discuss alternatives further, I said evenly, there's something you should know about the family cabin at Pine Ridge. Michael's expression registered confusion as I slid the envelope toward him. What about it? Open this, I instructed. Gently. He hesitated briefly before reaching for the envelope, removing the contents with the careful precision that characterized so many of his movements now. I watched as he examined the first document. The original deed showing the creation of the Eleanor Jameson Trust, named for my maiden name, dated 3 months before my divorce from Richard was finalized. His brow furrowed as he turned to the second document, continuous property tax receipts spanning 40 years, all paid by the same trust. The third document showed regular maintenance expenses, a new roof in 1989, updated plumbing in 1998, electrical work in 2007, all carefully preserved in my records. Finally, he reached the photographs, recent images showing the cabin in excellent condition with subtle evidence of my continued presence, a book on the side table that I had been reading the previous summer, fresh curtains I had sewn to replace ones damaged by sun exposure, the garden shed my father had built, now repainted in the same forest green he had originally chosen. I don't understand, Michael said finally, looking up from the documents with genuine confusion. These look like… Mom, are you saying you've owned the cabin all this time? Yes, I confirmed simply. I never lost it in the divorce. I created a private trust to protect it before the proceedings began. For 40 years, I've maintained it, preserved it, and kept it exactly as your grandfather built it, while allowing you and your father to believe it had been sold. Vanessa's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. Neither of us moved to clean up the spill as she stared at me with undisguised shock. That's not possible, Michael insisted, shuffling through the documents. again as if searching for evidence that would disprove my claim. Dad said it was sold as part of the settlement. He's been negotiating to buy it back. Your father discovered the trust about 6 months ago, I explained. His real estate connections likely noticed the similarity between the trust name and my maiden name. Rather than approach me directly, he apparently developed this plan to recover it as a grand gesture, after tearing down everything your grandfather built, of course. Michael's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally, the dawning realization that everything he had believed about the cabin, and perhaps about me, had been built on assumptions that were now crumbling. "Why would you keep this secret?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, why didn't you tell me?" It was the question I had anticipated, the one I had spent sleepless nights preparing to answer. Yet now, facing my son across, a table scattered with evidence of my decades-long deception, I found myself searching for the right words. At first, it was about protection. I began carefully. The cabin was my family's legacy, something your grandfather built with his own hands. The divorce was bitter, and your father's legal team was determined to claim everything of value. Creating the trust was the only way to preserve what mattered most to me. The directness of her question cut through the emotion of the moment. I reached back into my purse and withdrew the final document, the trust modification I had signed in Sarah's office. My original intention was to leave the cabin to Michael, I explained, placing the document on the table. For 40 years, the trust has specified that upon my death, ownership would transfer to my son. Michael's expression softened slightly at this revelation. And now? Now I've amended the trust, I said, my voice steady despite the weight of this decision. In light of recent events, specifically being told I'm not welcome at my only child's wedding, I've designated the Pine Ridge Environmental Conservancy as the beneficiary instead. The cabin and land will be preserved in perpetuity, never developed or significantly altered from my father's original design. The silence that followed was profound. Vanessa stared at the shattered glass on the floor, as if seeing a metaphor for the plans that had just collapsed. Michael continued to hold the photographs, his thumbs unconsciously tracing the outlines of the cabin where he had spent his earliest summers. "You're punishing me," he finally said, an edge of Richard's entitlement creeping into his voice. "Because we asked for a wedding accommodation, you're taking away a family legacy." "No, Michael," I replied, maintaining my composure though my heart ached at his interpretation. "I'm acknowledging that we have different values about what family means. If I'm not important enough to include in your wedding day, then perhaps my family's legacy isn't important enough to include in your future." "That's manipulative," Vanessa interjected, finding her voice again. "You're using this property to force yourself into our wedding." I turned to her with a calm that came from absolute clarity of purpose. "I'm not forcing anything, Vanessa. I'm making decisions about property I've maintained for 40 years, based on the values demonstrated by the people involved. You've made your choice about my place in your celebration. I've made mine about the future of my family's legacy." Michael stood abruptly, pacing to the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the city lights below. When he turned back, his expression had hardened into something reminiscent of Richard during our divorce. Calculating, assessing leverage. "We can challenge this legally," he stated. "The deception over decades, the hidden asset during the divorce, Dad's attorneys would have a field day with this. The threat might have wounded me deeply had I not anticipated it. The trust was created legally before the divorce proceedings began," I explained calmly. "Your father's attorneys can certainly try to challenge it, but Sarah Thompson has maintained impeccable records for 40 years. She's now a senior partner at Jacobson and Reed, specializing in trust law." The mention of one of the city's most prestigious law firms gave Michael visible pause. While Richard had connections, Sarah's legal expertise in this specific area would make any challenge difficult and potentially embarrassing. There is one element of the amendment that might interest you, I continued when neither Michael nor Vanessa spoke. The transfer to the conservancy doesn't become irrevocable until either my death or 1 year from today, whichever comes later. That provision creates a window, a year in which perspectives might evolve and choices might be reconsidered. A year to change our wedding plans, you mean, Vanessa clarified, her tone bitter. Or lose the property forever. A year to reflect on what family truly means, I corrected gently. On both sides, I've maintained this cabin for 40 years not as a bargaining chip, but as a labor of love, preserving something created by my father for future generations. If that future no longer includes me at significant family moments, perhaps the legacy should follow a different path. Michael returned to the table, sitting heavily in his chair. I need time to process this, he said, his voice strained. Finding out my mother has secretly owned property for decades, that my father lied about buying it back, that you're now threatening to donate it away, it's a lot to take in at once. Of course, I agreed, gathering my things and standing. Take whatever time you need. The amendment is dated today, so the 1-year window has just begun. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that every board, every nail, every stone in that cabin has been preserved exactly as your grandfather built it, out of love for a family legacy I hoped would continue. As I moved toward the door, Vanessa remained frozen beside the shattered glass, her carefully constructed plans now as fragmented as the crystal on the floor. Michael followed me to the entryway, his expression a complex mixture of anger, confusion, and something that might have been respect. I never knew you had this in you, Mom, he said quietly, holding the door. This level of calculation. I paused, looking directly into the eyes of the son I had raised alone, seeing glimpses of the boy he had been beneath the man Richard had shaped him to become. There's a great deal you don't know about me, Michael, I replied with a sad smile. Perhaps that's the real tragedy in all of this, that you never thought to ask. The drive home through darkened streets gave me time to process the confrontation. The look on Michael's face when he realized I still owned the cabin would indeed stay with me forever, not as a triumph, but as the moment when my son finally saw me as something more than the limited character he had constructed in his mind. Whether this revelation would lead to reconciliation or permanent estrangement remained uncertain. But for the first time in decades, our relationship would proceed from a place of truth rather than comfortable fictions, however painful that truth might be. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone chimed with a text message from Sarah. How did it go? I sat for a moment in the quiet car, considering how to summarize an encounter that had shattered 40 years of carefully maintained illusions. Finally, I typed, "The cabin is out of the shadows now. So am I." The week following my revelation, at Michael and Vanessa's condominium passed in silence. No calls, no messages, just the hollow quiet of relationships in crisis. I moved through my days with outward calm, continuing my volunteer work at the local library and tending to my small garden, while inwardly questioning whether I had destroyed my relationship with my only child in my determination to be recognized. Then, 10 days after our confrontation, a text message appeared from an unexpected source. Eleanor, this is Vanessa. I'd like to speak with you privately. Coffee tomorrow at Riverside Cafe, 10 a.m. The message was so unexpected that I read it 3 times before responding with a simple agreement. What could Vanessa possibly want to discuss without Michael present? Was this a peace offering or another attempt to negotiate my exclusion from their wedding under different terms? The Riverside Cafe was neutral territory, neither the luxury establishments Vanessa typically frequented, nor the cozy neighborhood spots I preferred. When I arrived the following morning, I spotted her immediately at a corner table, dressed more casually than I had ever seen her in jeans and a simple blouse, her usual perfect makeup noticeably absent. "Thank you for coming," she said as I took the seat across from her. The practiced charm that usually characterized our interactions was missing, replaced by something that looked surprisingly like vulnerability. "Of course," I replied, studying her with curiosity. "Is Michael joining us?" "No," she answered quickly. "He doesn't know I'm here. After what happened, we've been having some difficult conversations." She fidgeted with her coffee cup, clearly uncomfortable. "I needed to speak with you woman to woman, without Michael's perspective influencing things." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "First, I want to apologize for how I handled the wedding situation," Vanessa began. The words, coming with visible effort. "Uninviting you through that lunch was cowardly and cruel. I should have pushed back harder when Richard suggested it would be cleaner if you weren't there." The admission surprised me. "Richard specifically suggested I shouldn't attend?" Vanessa nodded, a flicker of anger crossing her face. "He framed it as concern for everyone's comfort, but looking back, I should have questioned his motives more thoroughly, especially now that I understand about the cabin." She took a deep breath before continuing. "The thing is, Eleanor, I've been raised in a world where appearances matter above everything. My parents' entire social existence revolves around who's invited where, who sits at which table, which connections are leveraged for advantage. When Richard raised concerns about potential awkwardness at the wedding, it triggered all my conditioning about social harmony trumping personal relationships. It was the most genuine thing I had ever heard her say. The carefully constructed facade had cracked, revealing something more complicated beneath. "After you left that night," she continued, "Michael and I had the first real fight of our relationship. He was angry about the cabin, about being denied what he saw as his rightful inheritance. But when I suggested we could use the year window to simply include you in the wedding and secure the property, he became even more upset. This surprised me. He didn't want to reconsider the wedding arrangements?" "That's what shocked me too," Vanessa admitted. "He said, 'This isn't about the damn cabin anymore. It's about the fact that my mother has been living a completely different life than I thought for 40 years. It's about the fact that the modest, simple woman I've been dismissing as naive and limited has been executing a sophisticated legal and financial strategy since before I was born.'" Hearing my son's words quoted back to me created a complex emotional response. Pain at his anger, but also a glimmer of something like hope that he was finally seeing me as a complete person rather than a convenient caricature. "What happened then?" I asked quietly. "I asked him if he was more upset about being excluded from your secret or about not getting the property," Vanessa said, her eyes meeting mine directly. His answer made me realize I don't actually know the man I'm planning to marry as well as I thought I did. She paused, visibly struggling with whether to share something deeply personal. "My father built his real estate empire by prioritizing business connections over family at every turn. My mother has spent 40 years arranging her entire existence around his preferences and social ambitions. When Michael couldn't immediately answer whether he valued you or the property more, I saw my parents' marriage reflected back at me, and it terrified me. The honesty of this confession created an unexpected opening between us, a brief moment of genuine human connection without the layers of social positioning that had characterized our previous interactions. "The cabin isn't just property to me, Vanessa," I explained gently. "It's the physical embodiment of my father's love, of sacrifice spanning generations. Every summer I've spent there alone while Michael was with Richard in Europe, I've maintained it with the hope that someday my grandchildren would know their great-grandfather through the home he built." "I understand that now," Vanessa said, surprising me again. "After you left, I stayed up all night looking at those photographs you brought. The care in every detail, the preservation of something authentic and meaningful. It's the opposite of the disposable luxury I've been raised to value." She hesitated before adding, "I think I want more of what you value in my life and less of what my parents taught me matters." This admission hung between us, creating a moment of unexpected connection. For the first time, I was seeing beyond the polished surface to the woman underneath, someone potentially more complex and thoughtful than I had given her credit for. "I've made a decision," Vanessa continued after a pause. "With or without Michael's agreement, I'm not having a wedding where his mother isn't welcome. I've already contacted the resort in Santorini to cancel our reservation." "Canceled the wedding?" I asked, alarmed that my actions had precipitated such a drastic response. "Not the marriage," she clarified quickly. "Just the elaborate destination, event with all of Richard's business connections. If Michael still wants to marry me, we'll need to create something different, something that honors authentic family connections rather than business opportunities." The courage this decision must have required impressed me. For someone raised in Vanessa's world, canceling an elaborate society wedding represented a genuine risk, potential social embarrassment, parental disappointment, commentary from their circle. "How did Michael react to this decision?" I asked, trying to gauge where my son stood in this unexpected development. "I haven't told him yet," Vanessa admitted. "That's partly why I wanted to see you first. Before I take such a definitive step, I needed to understand something." She leaned forward, her expression earnest. "The trust amendment gives us a year before the cabin transfers to the Conservancy. If we create a wedding that includes you, truly, includes you, not as an afterthought but as the mother of the groom deserves, would you consider reversing the amendment?" The directness of the question took me by surprise. "Is that why you're here? To negotiate for the property?" 6 days ago it would have been, Vanessa admitted with unexpected candor. "But something has changed in me since seeing those photographs, since understanding what 40 years of quiet preservation looks like compared to my parents' constant pursuit of the next status symbol." She pulled out her phone, showing me her screen. "I've been researching the Pine Ridge Environmental Conservancy. Their mission to preserve natural lakefront property from development aligns with environmental values I've actually held for years, but never prioritized in my decisions. If you donate the cabin, it would be protected forever, which has its own kind of beauty." This thoughtful consideration was so far from the Vanessa I thought I knew that I found myself reevaluating my assumptions about her character. "What I'm trying to say," she continued, visibly struggling to articulate complex emotions, "is that I'm not here to negotiate for the property. I'm here because I want a different kind of relationship with my future mother-in-law than my mother has with her in-laws. I want to understand the woman who loved something enough to protect it quietly for 40 years without needing credit or recognition." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. Whatever I had expected from this meeting, it wasn't this moment of genuine connection with the woman I had assumed would never understand my values. "The wedding was always more Richard's vision than ours anyway," Vanessa added with a wry smile that suggested newfound self-awareness. "All those business connections, the strategic seating arrangements, the calculated networking opportunities, it was like planning a corporate merger rather than celebrating a marriage." I couldn't help but smile at this assessment, which precisely captured my impression of the event they had been planning. "And what would your vision be if you were creating a wedding based on your actual values?" The question seemed to catch her off guard, as though no one had ever asked what she truly wanted rather than what was expected. After a moment's reflection, she answered with surprising simplicity. "Something intimate and authentic. Somewhere beautiful and natural, with only people who genuinely care about us as individuals, not as networking opportunities." Her eyes took on a distant quality as she envisioned something different from the elaborate performance they had been planning. Maybe even somewhere, like the cabin, by the lake at sunset, with lanterns in the trees and simple food served family style at long tables. The image she painted was so contrary to the sophisticated socialite I had believed her to be that I found myself wondering how much of Vanessa's persona had been constructed to meet expectations rather than express her authentic self. "That sounds lovely," I said sincerely, "and vastly different from what you've been planning." "I know," she acknowledged with a self-deprecating laugh. If you told me 2 weeks ago I'd be canceling a luxury destination wedding in favor of something simple, by a lake, I wouldn't have believed it. Her expression grew serious again. But seeing those photographs, understanding what 40 years of quiet dedication looks like, it made me question everything about what I've been taught to value. We talked for another hour, the conversation flowing more naturally than I would have thought possible. Vanessa shared stories about her childhood in a family where appearances always trumped authenticity, where her mother's genuine interests were systematically subordinated to her father's social ambitions. I found myself recognizing patterns that paralleled my early years with Richard, creating an unexpected bridge of understanding between us. "What happens now?" I asked as our meeting drew to a close. "Have you spoken with Michael about any of this?" "Not yet," Vanessa admitted. "We've been circling each other cautiously since your revelation. He's been speaking with Richard almost daily, which concerns me given what we now know about the cabin deception. Richard will be encouraging him to challenge the trust amendment legally," I observed, understanding my ex-husband's probable strategy. Vanessa nodded. "Almost certainly. But I think there's something else happening too. Michael has spent his entire adult life trying to earn his father's approval by adopting his values and perspectives. Your revelation has created the first serious crack in that foundation. He's questioning things he's accepted as truth for decades." As we prepared to leave, Vanessa hesitated before asking one final question. "Would you be willing to show me the cabin? Not Michael yet, just me. I want to understand what you've preserved before I try to help him see its value." The request was unexpected, but felt genuine. "Yes," I agreed after a moment's consideration. "I think that would be a good first step." As we parted ways outside the cafe, Vanessa surprised me with a brief but sincere hug. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, "and for maintaining that cabin all these years. Whatever happens with the trust amendment, I'm grateful to understand the kind of woman my children might have as a grandmother someday." The comment caught me off guard. This was the first mention of potential grandchildren, a future I had begun to fear might never include me. The thought that Vanessa was considering my role in their children's lives suggested a shift in perspective I hadn't dared hope for after the wedding exclusion. Driving home, I reflected on how completely this meeting had upended my assumptions about Vanessa. I had cast her as the villain in my narrative, the social climbing fiancée who viewed me as an inconvenient reminder of Michael's less sophisticated origins. The reality appeared far more complex, a woman who had been raised in a world of appearance, over substance, but who might be more capable of growth and self-reflection than I had given her credit for. Whether this unexpected alliance would lead to genuine reconciliation with Michael remained uncertain. But for the first time since the wedding exclusion, I felt a glimmer of hope that something authentic might emerge from the painful truths, now exposed, not just regarding the cabin, but about the values that would shape our family's future. 3 days after my coffee with Vanessa, I drove to Pine Ridge with her beside me in the passenger seat. The journey felt symbolic. Crossing the distance between my carefully hidden past and an uncertain future, Vanessa had been uncharacteristically quiet for most of the drive, watching the urban landscape gradually give way to rolling countryside and finally the dense pine forests that gave the lake region its name. "It's beautiful here," she observed, as we turned onto the unpaved road leading to the cabin. "So different from the manicured country club properties my parents preferred. My father chose this location deliberately," I explained, navigating the familiar curves with practiced ease. "He wanted somewhere that felt removed from the artificial world, somewhere that required you to adapt to nature rather than bending nature to human preferences." As we rounded the final bend and the cabin came into view, I heard Vanessa's soft intake of breath. The afternoon sunlight filtered through tall pines, casting dappled shadows across the weathered cedar siding and forest green shutters. Wildflowers bordered the stone path my father had laid by hand, their colors vivid against the natural landscape. The photographs didn't do it justice, Vanessa murmured as we parked. It feels sacred somehow. The word choice surprised me. Sacred was not a term I would have expected from the pragmatic, status-conscious woman I had assumed Vanessa to be. Yet it perfectly captured what this place had meant to my family across generations. As I unlocked the cabin door, I felt a momentary hesitation. For 40 years, this space had been my private sanctuary, the one place where I maintained complete control over my environment and my memories. Allowing Vanessa inside represented a level of vulnerability I hadn't anticipated when agreeing to this visit. My father built most of this with his own hands, I explained as we stepped into the main room with its soaring ceiling and stone fireplace. He was a construction foreman by profession, but this place was his personal masterpiece. Vanessa moved through the space with unexpected reverence, her fingers lightly tracing the hand-hewn beams, her eyes taking in details that most visitors might overlook: the careful joinery of the mantelpiece, the subtle pattern in the stone hearth, the way each window had been positioned to capture a specific view of the lake or forest. "You can feel the intention in everything," she observed quietly. "Nothing is random or carelessly placed." I nodded, unexpectedly moved by her perception. That was my father's philosophy. He believed that spaces shape the way we live within them, that a thoughtfully created home encourages thoughtful living. We continued through the cabin, with me sharing stories connected to different spaces: the kitchen where my grandmother had taught me to bake her famous blackberry pies, the reading nook where my mother had spent countless hours with her beloved, poetry collections, the screened porch where my father and I had played marathon games of chess during summer thunderstorms. When we reached the small bedroom that had been Michael's during our family summers, Vanessa paused at the bookshelf still, lined with adventure novels and field guides from his childhood. "He never mentioned any of this," she said, lifting a worn copy of Hatchet that had been Michael's favorite at age 10. The way he talked about his childhood, I assumed there were no happy memories from before his teen years with Richard. "There were many happy times," I corrected gently. "But I think when Michael chose to align himself with Richard's values, it became easier to minimize those memories rather than reconcile them with the path he had chosen." Vanessa replaced the book carefully, her expression thoughtful. "It's as though he created a narrative where his real life began when Richard took a more active role in his teens, and everything before that was just prologue." "Exactly," I agreed, struck by the insight. "And in that narrative, I became a supporting character rather than a full person with my own story." We ended our tour on the dock extending into the lake, sitting side by side as afternoon transitioned toward evening, the water's surface turning golden with reflected sunset. In the distance, a pair of loons called to each other, their haunting cries echoing across the water. "I understand now," Vanessa said finally, breaking a comfortable silence. "Why you preserved this place, why it matters so much. It's not just property, it's the physical embodiment of your family's values and history." "Yes," I confirmed, grateful for her understanding. "Every board, every stone represents my father's belief that creating something of lasting quality matters more than momentary convenience or passing trends." Vanessa turned to face me directly, her expression more serious than I had ever seen. I need to tell you something. After our coffee meeting, I went to see Richard." This admission caught me completely off guard. "Richard? Why?" "I needed to understand his side of the story," she explained. "To hear directly from him why he lied about the cabin being sold, why he was supposedly negotiating to buy back property he knew you still owned." The thought of Vanessa confronting Richard, a man whose calculating charm had intimidated far more experienced individuals, both concerned and impressed me. "What did he say?" "He was surprised to see me alone, of course," Vanessa began, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. At first, he tried to dismiss my questions, suggesting I didn't understand the complexities of the situation. When I pressed him, he claimed he was only trying to create a happy outcome for everyone, recovering the property as a gesture of goodwill, creating a modern lake house the whole family could enjoy. And you didn't believe him, I observed, hearing the skepticism in her voice. No, she confirmed, especially when I asked why he didn't simply approach you directly once he discovered the trust. His answer was revealing. He said you would have complicated things with sentimentality, and that the existing structure was worthless except for the land it sits on. The dismissal of my father's craftsmanship as worthless stung even after 40 years, confirming that Richard remained the same person who had never valued anything beyond its monetary worth or status potential. What happened then? I asked, curious about how this unexpected confrontation had concluded. I told him I'd seen the cabin, Vanessa said, a new confidence in her voice. That I understood now what quality craftsmanship and genuine heritage meant compared to the disposable luxury he had always pursued. His expression... She paused, searching for the right words. It was like watching someone realize they'd completely misread a situation they thought they controlled perfectly. The image brought an unexpected smile to my face. Richard rarely encountered direct challenges to his calculated manipulations, particularly from those he assumed were aligned with his values. Before I left, Vanessa continued, he said something I think you should know. He implied that Michael would eventually see reason and challenge the trust amendment legally, that he would make certain his son didn't allow sentimentality to interfere with claiming what rightfully belongs to him. This revelation, while concerning, wasn't surprising. Richard had always excelled at positioning himself as the rational voice against what he framed as emotional female irrationality. That he would attempt to drive a legal wedge between Michael and me was entirely in character. Has Michael mentioned any legal challenges to you? I asked carefully. Not directly, Vanessa admitted. But he's been withdrawn, spending long hours at the office and taking private calls I suspect are with Richard or his attorneys. I'm worried about the influence Richard still holds over him. We sat in thoughtful silence as the sun dipped lower, painting the lake surface with deeper golds and ambers. A fish jumped nearby, creating ripples that spread in perfect circles across the still water. What would it take, Vanessa asked finally, for you to consider reversing the trust amendment, not just regarding the wedding, but more fundamentally? What would need to change in your relationship with Michael? It was the question I had been asking myself since that confrontational dinner. What did I truly want beyond simply being included in my son's wedding day? Recognition, I said after careful consideration. Not just of my legal right to this property, but of my existence as a complete person with my own story, my own accomplishments, my own values. For 40 years, I've been reduced to a character in Michael's narrative, the simple-minded mother who needed his guidance and protection. I need him to see me as I actually am, not as the convenient fiction he created to align with Richard's world. Vanessa nodded slowly. That makes perfect sense. And having seen this place, having understood what you've preserved all these years, I think Michael needs to see it too. Not just the property, but the truth of who his mother really is. 3 days passed with no word from Michael or Vanessa. I tried to focus on my daily routines, volunteering at the library, tending my garden, meeting with my retired teacher's book club, but found myself checking my phone with increasing frequency, hoping for some indication that Vanessa had succeeded in reaching through to my son. On the 4th day, as evening approached, a text message appeared from an unexpected source. Mom, it's Michael. Can we talk? I'm outside your house. My heart raced as I looked through the front window. Sure enough, Michael's sleek black car was parked at the curb, and he sat inside, seemingly gathering his thoughts before approaching the door. I took a deep breath, smoothed my hair, and opened the door before he could knock. Michael, I said simply, my voice steadier than I felt. He stood on my porch looking uncharacteristically disheveled, his usually perfect appearance showing signs of strain, tie loosened, hair slightly rumpled, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice carrying none of the confident authority I had grown accustomed to hearing. I stepped aside wordlessly, allowing him into the modest home where he had grown up, but now rarely visited. He entered the living room and stood awkwardly, as though seeing the familiar space through new eyes, noting the handcrafted bookshelf my father had built, the quilt my grandmother had made draped across the sofa, the watercolor of Pine Ridge Lake hanging above the fireplace. "Vanessa told me she visited the cabin with you," he began, his gaze still moving around the room as though cataloging previously unnoticed details. "She described it differently than I remembered." "It's been maintained exactly as it was," I replied, "though perhaps she saw it with different eyes than the child you were when you last visited." Michael nodded slowly. "She said it helped her understand you better, that there was more to the story than either of us had recognized." I gestured toward the sofa, and we both sat, maintaining a careful distance between us. This was the closest we had been physically since the confrontational dinner where I had revealed my decades-long secret. "I've been meeting with Dad and his attorneys," Michael continued after a moment. "They believe we have grounds to challenge the trust amendment based on the deception during the divorce proceedings." Though the word stung, I wasn't surprised. I expected as much. "That's what I wanted to do initially," he admitted. "I was angry, furious really, that you had hidden this from me for decades, that you were using it as leverage to force your way into our wedding plans." I started to object to this characterization, but he held up his hand. "Please, let me finish. That's how I saw it at first. But something Vanessa said after visiting the cabin made me stop and reconsider everything." "What was that?" I asked, curious about what insight could have penetrated the narrative Richard was undoubtedly constructing. She asked me a simple question. "Why did your mother maintain that cabin perfectly for 40 years if she never intended for you to have it?" It wasn't a legal question or a financial calculation. It was about motivation, about intentions spanning decades. It was a perceptive question that went to the heart of the matter, revealing Vanessa's emotional intelligence in a way that surprised me. "I didn't have a good answer," Michael continued. "Dad's attorneys kept talking about hidden assets and legal technicalities, but they couldn't explain why you would preserve a family property for 40 years, only to change the inheritance plan now. It didn't align with the narrative they were creating about your motives." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "So I started asking different questions, not about the legal aspects, but about you, about the mother I thought I knew versus the woman who had executed a sophisticated legal strategy before I was even born." This shift in perspective, from seeing me as a legal adversary to recognizing me as a complex person with my own narrative, represented the first step toward what I had most wanted: true recognition. "Dad couldn't answer those questions," Michael admitted. "Or wouldn't. He kept steering the conversation back to property values and legal strategies. But Vanessa..." He smiled slightly, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him in our conversation. "Vanessa refused to let it go. She kept pushing me to consider your perspective, to try to understand why preserving that cabin mattered enough for you to maintain the secret for decades." "And what conclusions did you reach?" I asked carefully. Michael met my eyes directly for the first time. "That I never really knew you at all. That I accepted a narrative about you, about your capabilities, your financial acumen, your values, without ever questioning if it was accurate. That I reduced you to a convenient character in my life story, rather than recognizing you as the author of your own." The acknowledgement was so precisely what I had longed to hear that I found myself momentarily speechless. After decades of being underestimated, and dismissed. Having my son recognize the fundamental mischaracterization felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. "I want to see the cabin," Michael said into the silence. "Not with Dad's real estate valuation mindset or with legal challenges in mind. I want to see what you've preserved all these years, to understand what it means to you, what it meant to your father." "I would like that," I replied simply, recognizing the courage it had taken for him to make this request, despite Richard's undoubted opposition. "There's something else," he continued, his expression growing more serious. "After talking with Vanessa, after really thinking about what excluding you from our wedding represented, we've decided to cancel the Santorini plans entirely." This news, while not entirely unexpected after my conversations with Vanessa, still surprised me coming from Michael. "Are you postponing the wedding?" "Not postponing," he clarified. "Reimagining. Vanessa and I have been having some very honest conversations about what matters to us, about starting our marriage with authentic values rather than social performance." He hesitated before adding, "We're considering a much smaller ceremony, with only people who truly care about us present. We were wondering if, that is," Vanessa suggested. I waited patiently as he struggled to articulate whatever they had discussed. "Would it be possible to have our wedding at the cabin?" he finally asked. "By the lake, with the sunset over the water, in a place built with genuine care rather than a resort chosen for its exclusivity?" The request caught me completely off guard. From being excluded from their elaborate destination wedding to having them request the cabin as their venue represented such a dramatic reversal that I found myself momentarily overwhelmed. "You want to be married at Pine Ridge?" I clarified, wanting to be certain I understood correctly. Michael nodded, a vulnerability in his expression I hadn't seen since he was young. "If we're going to start our life together, it should be somewhere with meaning and history, not somewhere chosen to impress people we barely know." "What about Richard's business connections? The networking opportunities you mentioned were so important to your future." I couldn't help asking, remembering his justifications for excluding me. Michael's expression hardened briefly before softening into something that looked like regret. "Dad was disappointed, to put it mildly. He's been making it clear that declining to include his business associates represents a missed opportunity for my career advancement." He shook his head slightly. "But Vanessa helped me see that building. Our marriage on authentic connections matters more than cultivating strategic business relationships." This shift in perspective, prioritizing genuine relationships over strategic advantage, represented such a departure from the values Michael had absorbed from Richard that I found myself wondering what other conversations had transpired between him and Vanessa. "The cabin would be perfect for your wedding," I said finally, meaning it wholeheartedly. "Your grandfather would have been so pleased to see it used for such a milestone event." "There's something else I need to ask," Michael continued, his expression growing serious again. "About the trust amendment donating the property to the Conservancy." I nodded, having anticipated this question. "The amendment isn't irrevocable, yet. There's still a 1-year window during which it could be modified or rescinded." "I'm not asking you to change it," Michael said, surprising me yet again. "At least, not right away. I think I need to earn back the right to inherit that legacy, to demonstrate that I understand and value what it represents, not just as property, but as the embodiment of family values worth preserving." This recognition, that the cabin represented more than a financial asset, was precisely what I had hoped might eventually emerge from our confrontation. That Michael had reached this understanding so quickly, despite Richard's undoubted counter-narrative, suggested a depth of character I had begun to fear had been completely overshadowed by his father's influence. "What are you proposing?" I asked, curious about how he envisioned moving forward. "First, I'd like us to visit the cabin together," he said thoughtfully. "For me to see it through adult eyes, to understand what you've preserved all these years. Then, if you're willing, I'd like to learn from you about Grandpa's craftsmanship, about the maintenance you've done, about the history embedded in every corner of that place." The idea of sharing the cabin with Michael, not just as a piece of property, but as the repository of family history and values, created a surge of emotion I hadn't expected. For decades, I had maintained that space alone, preserving memories and craftsmanship without anyone to appreciate the effort or understand its significance. I would like that very much, I said softly. And about the wedding, Michael continued, seeming encouraged by my response. We're thinking something small in late summer, when the wildflowers are in bloom and the evening light on the lake is at its most beautiful. Just family and our closest friends, people who know us as we really are, not as we present ourselves professionally. The vision he described was so far from the elaborate destination event they had been planning that I marveled at the transformation in their thinking. Something about the cabin, or perhaps Vanessa's perception of what it represented, had catalyzed a fundamental shift in their approach to beginning their married life. That sounds lovely, I said sincerely. Though I imagine Richard and Vanessa's parents might have other opinions about such a significant change in plans. Michael's expression confirmed my suspicion. Dad is adjusting to the idea. He suggested we could at least host a separate reception at his country club for his business associates, but Vanessa was surprisingly firm in refusing. A hint of admiration entered his voice as he added, She told him we were starting our marriage by being true to ourselves, not by performing for strategic advantage. This glimpse of Vanessa standing up to Richard, something that had intimidated far more experienced individuals, reinforced my growing appreciation for her character beyond the polished social facade. And her parents? I asked, knowing from our previous conversations that they shared many of Richard's values regarding social positioning. They're disappointed about losing the Instagram-worthy destination photos, Michael admitted with a wry smile that suggested newfound perspective. But something interesting happened when Vanessa explained our reasoning. Her mother pulled her aside and said, Maybe you're braver than I was at your age. There's a story there we don't fully understand yet. As our conversation continued into the evening, I felt the careful distance between us gradually diminishing. Michael asked questions about my life that he had never thought to ask before, about my teaching career, about the strategic financial decisions I had made raising him. Alone, about the values my father had instilled that had guided my choices. For perhaps the first time in our adult relationship, he seemed genuinely interested in understanding me as a complete person, rather than the simplified character he had constructed in his mind. Though reconciliation would require more than a single conversation, this opening represented the essential first step, recognition of my full humanity beyond the limited role he had assigned me in his narrative. As Michael prepared to leave, he paused at the door, seeming to struggle with something he wanted to say. "I'm sorry, Mom," he finally offered, the words clearly difficult for him. Not just about the wedding, but about never really seeing you, about accepting Dad's narrative, without question, about dismissing your capabilities and values without ever trying to understand them. The apology, unexpected and clearly genuine, created a lump in my throat. "Thank you," I managed, recognizing the courage it had taken him to acknowledge these failures of perception. "Next weekend," he said as he stepped onto the porch. "If it works for you, Vanessa and I would like to visit the cabin, to begin learning about what you've preserved all these years." "Next weekend would be perfect," I agreed, feeling a cautious optimism I hadn't expected to experience so soon after our confrontation. As I watched his car disappear down the street, I reflected on how completely the dynamic had shifted in just 2 weeks. From being excluded from my son's wedding to having them request the cabin as their venue, from being dismissed as financially naive to having my decades of strategic preservation acknowledged, the transformation was remarkable in its speed and scope. Whether this represented lasting change or a temporary reaction to the shock of my revelation remained to be seen. But for the first time since discovering I had been uninvited from the wedding, I felt genuine hope that something authentic might be salvaged from the painful truths now exposed, not just regarding the cabin, but about the fundamental nature of our family relationships. The weekend visit to Pine Ridge marked the beginning of a gradual but profound transformation in my relationship with Michael. As we explored the cabin together, him seeing it through adult eyes, me sharing stories I had never thought he would be interested in hearing, I watched him reconnect with memories that had been submerged beneath years of Richard's influence. "I remember this," he said, running his fingers along the carved chess table on the screened porch. "You taught me to play here. I was terrible, but you never let me win easily. Your grandfather believed that hollow victories teach nothing," I explained, touched that he recalled these details. "He taught me that respect means expecting someone's best, not patronizing them with artificial success." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "A different philosophy than Dad's. He always emphasized winning at any cost, appearance over substance." This simple observation, contrasting his grandfather's values with Richard's, suggested a growing awareness of the different moral frameworks that had shaped his life. Throughout the weekend, similar moments of recognition occurred as Michael rediscovered aspects of his childhood that had been minimized in the narrative he had constructed as an adult. What surprised me most was Vanessa's genuine enthusiasm for the cabin's simple authenticity. Far from the status-conscious socialite I had assumed her to be, she showed a deep appreciation for the craftsmanship and intention evident in every corner. "You can feel the difference between something built to impress versus something built to endure," she observed, comparing the solid oak dining table to the trendy but already deteriorating furniture in their condominium. "We've been spending thousands on pieces that won't last a decade, while this table has survived generations of use and still looks beautiful." The weekend concluded with a sunset boat ride on the lake, the three of us sharing a comfortable silence as golden light transformed the water into a mirror reflecting pine-covered shores. As we docked and prepared to return to the city, Michael surprised me by asking a question I never expected. "Would you teach me, Mom, about maintaining the cabin, about the skills Grandpa used to build it? I realize I know nothing about preserving something valuable across generations." The request represented more than practical knowledge transfer. It acknowledged the wisdom embedded in my decades of careful preservation, wisdom he had previously dismissed as irrelevant to his sophisticated modern life. "I would be honored," I replied, meaning it wholeheartedly. Over the following months, as summer progressed toward their planned September wedding, Michael and I established a new weekly ritual. Every Saturday, we would drive to Pine Ridge together, where I would teach him aspects of cabin maintenance that had been my solitary responsibility for 40 years. How to check the hand-hewn beams for signs of stress, how to properly clean and preserve the stone fireplace, how to maintain the cedar siding against weather damage. "I never realized how much knowledge is required to preserve something properly," he admitted during one such lesson. "I assumed maintenance was just about paying professionals when needed, not about intimate understanding of materials and craftsmanship. That's the difference between owning something and being its steward," I explained. "Ownership is a legal concept. Stewardship is a relationship that requires knowledge, attention, and care." These philosophical discussions became as important as the practical skills I was teaching. Through them, Michael began to understand that the cabin represented not just property, but a value system, one that prioritized quality over quantity, durability over fashion, substance over appearance. Parallel to these weekend lessons, another unexpected development unfolded. Rather than maintaining the professional distance that had characterized our relationship for years, Michael began calling me regularly, often to discuss tensions arising as their wedding plans evolved. "Dad is still pushing for a separate reception at his country club," he confided during one such call. "He can't seem to accept that we're choosing a small family ceremony over strategic networking opportunities. How are you handling that pressure?" I asked, genuinely curious about his response to Richard's undoubted manipulation. "Better than I would have 3 months ago," he admitted. I'm starting to recognize when he's framing personal preferences as business necessities. The distinction wasn't clear to me before. This growing discernment, the ability to distinguish between Richard's self-interest and genuine career advice, represented significant emotional maturation. Michael was developing what therapists call differentiation, the capacity to maintain his own values and boundaries while remaining in relationship with his influential father. Vanessa underwent her own parallel transformation. As wedding plans progressed, she gradually distanced herself from her parents' social expectations, choosing authenticity over appearance in ways that surprised even Michael. She told her mother's interior designer friend that we don't want wedding gifts from their registry, Michael reported with a mixture of amusement and admiration, that we'd prefer contributions to the Pine Ridge Environmental Conservancy instead, since protecting natural spaces matters more to us than accumulating more stuff we don't need. This shift from accumulation to conservation, from social performance to authentic expression, reflected a fundamental realignment of values I had never expected to witness in the status-conscious couple I had known just months earlier. The most significant milestone in our evolving relationship came unexpectedly during a thunderstorm at the cabin. Michael and I had been working on replacing some weather-damaged shutters when the sky darkened prematurely. We barely made it inside before rain began pounding against the windows, thunder echoing across the lake. As we sat on the screened porch watching lightning illuminate the churning water, Michael turned to me with an expression I hadn't seen since. He was a child, vulnerable, seeking guidance rather than projecting certainty. "Mom, I need your advice about something important," he began, his voice barely audible above the storm. "It's about my career." For years, Michael had never sought my input on professional matters, assuming his corporate finance path was beyond my understanding or expertise. That he was now actively seeking my perspective represented a seismic shift in how he perceived my wisdom and experience. "I've been offered a promotion at the firm," he explained. "Senior Vice President of Client Development. More money, more prestige, more of what I've been working toward for years." "That sounds like wonderful recognition," I offered cautiously, hearing hesitation in his tone. "It would be, except—" He paused, struggling to articulate something. "The role would require me to focus primarily on cultivating relationships with Dad's business network, leveraging his connections to bring in new clients. I would essentially become the firm's relationship manager to Dad's world." The implications were clear. Increased professional dependence on Richard at precisely the moment Michael was beginning to establish psychological independence. "How do you feel about that aspect of the role?" I asked, careful not to impose my own assessment. 3 months ago, I would have seen it as a perfect strategic advantage, he admitted. Now, I'm questioning whether building my career on Dad's connections would ultimately undermine the independence I'm just starting to develop. The insight reflected remarkable self-awareness, recognition that professional advancement might come at the cost of personal growth. It was a nuanced calculation I wouldn't have believed Michael capable of making before our recent reconciliation. "What alternatives are you considering?" I asked, curious about how he was approaching this crossroads. "That's where I'd value your perspective," he replied. "The firm has another opening, less prestigious initially, but focused on developing environmental investment strategies for clients interested in sustainable portfolios. The compensation is lower, the path less certain, but something about it feels more aligned with values I'm reconnecting with here at the cabin." The choice he was describing, between status and authenticity, between Richard's world and values more aligned with my father's, seemed to encapsulate the fundamental crossroads he had reached in his personal development. "What would you do?" he asked directly, lightning illuminating his face in brief flashes that revealed his genuine uncertainty. I considered my response carefully, recognizing the significance of being asked for guidance after years of dismissal. "I can't tell you which path to choose," I said finally, but I can share what I've learned from 40 years of maintaining this cabin while building a teaching career that many, including your father, considered modest and unambitious. Michael leaned forward, listening with an openness I had rarely seen in our adult relationship. True wealth isn't measured by what you display to others, but by what you preserve for yourself and future generations, I continued. I chose to be wealthy in things that couldn't be taken away: knowledge, integrity, purpose, authentic relationships. That choice meant driving older cars and living in a smaller house, but it also meant never compromising my values for status or approval. Thunder rumbled as my words hung between us, the storm outside echoing the emotional turbulence of the choices he faced. I think I've been chasing the wrong kind of success, Michael said finally, measuring my worth by metrics that never quite satisfied something deeper in me. 2 days later, he called to tell me he had accepted the environmental investment position, declining the more prestigious role tied to Richard's network. His father's disappointment had been palpable, but Michael had maintained his decision with a quiet confidence that reminded me of my father's steadfast nature. The wedding day dawned with perfect September weather, golden light filtering through, pine trees, the lake surface calm and reflective as a mirror. We had spent the previous week preparing the cabin and grounds, string lights hung in the trees, simple wooden benches arranged to face the lake where a natural altar of stones had been created. As I helped Vanessa with final preparations in the cabin's master bedroom, she turned to me with unexpected emotion. "I need to thank you, Eleanor," she said, her eyes meeting mine in the antique mirror as I adjusted her simple flower crown. "Not just for the cabin, but for preserving values that Michael and I almost lost completely. You recognized their worth when given the chance to see them," I replied, touched by her sincerity. "That speaks to something authentic in you that was perhaps waiting for permission to emerge." She smiled, a genuine expression so different from the calculated charm I had first encountered. "My mother arrived earlier than expected," she continued. "I found her sitting on the dock alone, crying. When I asked what was wrong, she said they weren't tears of sadness, but of recognition, that this place made her remember values her own parents had held before social climbing became their priority. This ripple effect, how the authenticity of the cabin seemed to awaken forgotten priorities in even the most status-conscious guests, continued throughout the day. Richard arrived impeccably dressed but visibly uncomfortable, his usual commanding. Presence diminished by surroundings that valued substance over appearance. Yet by evening, even he seemed softened by the genuine joy evident in the celebration, his practiced networking smile occasionally giving way to moments of what looked like genuine reflection. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. Michael and Vanessa exchanging vows they had written themselves, speaking of building a marriage based on authentic connection rather than social performance. Standing beside the lake where 4 generations of my family had gathered, they pledged to create a life that honored substance over appearance, stewardship over ownership, legacy over momentary advantage. As the golden light of late afternoon bathed the gathering in a warm glow, Michael surprised me by adding an unplanned element to the ceremony. He asked everyone to remain seated after the traditional pronouncement, then turned to address the small gathering of their closest friends and family. "Today isn't just about beginning our marriage," he said, his voice carrying across the still water. "It's about honoring legacies that almost slipped away." He turned toward me, seated in the front row. "Mom, would you join us?" Confused but curious, I made my way to where they stood by the water's edge. Michael took my hand and Vanessa's, creating a circle among the 3 of us. "Many of you don't know the full story of this cabin," he began, addressing the guests but looking at me. "For 40 years, my mother preserved this place, not just the structure, but the values it represents, while letting everyone, including me, believe it had been lost in her divorce. She maintained it quietly, without recognition, because she understood that some legacies are worth protecting at any cost. Murmurs moved through the small gathering as people began to understand the significance of what he was sharing. When Vanessa and I chose to be married here, it wasn't just because of the beautiful setting. It was because we wanted our marriage to begin in a place built with intention and maintained with devotion, qualities we hope will characterize our life together. Michael reached into his pocket and withdrew a document I immediately recognized, the trust amendment I had signed, in Sarah's office. "Mom, in front of these witnesses, I want to give you this," he said, handing me the document. "It's a new trust amendment I've had prepared. It doesn't restore me as beneficiary of the cabin. Instead, it creates a family stewardship arrangement where the property remains under your control during your lifetime, then passes to a multi-generational trust that ensures it will never be developed or fundamentally altered from Grandpa's original vision. The thoughtfulness of this arrangement, acknowledging my right to control what I had preserved while ensuring its protection beyond any individual lifetime, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "I don't want to own this cabin," Michael continued, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "I want to be worthy of helping steward it, of continuing the legacy of care you've maintained for decades." In that moment, standing beside the lake where my father had taught me to value substance over appearance, I felt a completion of a circle that had begun 40 years earlier when I first created the trust to protect our family legacy from Richard's legal maneuvers. What had begun as a defensive measure had evolved into something far more meaningful, a multi-generational commitment to values worth preserving. The wedding celebration continued into evening, lanterns glowing in the pine trees, simple but delicious food served family style at long tables set on the lawn. I found myself in conversations with people from Michael and Vanessa's lives who seemed genuinely interested in understanding the cabin's history and significance. A sharp contrast to the networking-focused interactions I had anticipated from their social circle. As night fell and stars appeared above the lake, I slipped away from the celebration to sit briefly on the dock, absorbing the magnitude of the day's events. The young couple dancing beneath string lights on the lawn were nearly unrecognizable from the status-conscious pair who had excluded me from their wedding plans just months earlier. The transformation in our relationships, from dismissal to recognition, from exclusion to central importance, seemed almost too profound to absorb in a single evening. Sarah joined me on the dock, her expression reflecting similar thoughts. "When you signed that trust amendment in my office," she observed quietly, "did you ever imagine it would lead to this outcome?" "Never," I admitted, watching the celebration unfold against the backdrop of the cabin my father had built. "I thought I was protecting a physical legacy. I never imagined I was actually creating the catalyst for something much more valuable." "Recognition," Sarah supplied, echoing the word I had used months earlier when describing what I truly wanted from Michael. "Not just of your legal right to the property, but of your existence as a complete person with your own story." "Yes," I agreed, watching my son and his new wife move among their guests with a groundedness I had never before seen in them, and perhaps recognition of values that both of them needed but had forgotten how to prioritize. As I rejoined the celebration, Michael approached with 2 glasses of champagne, handing one to me. "I've been thinking about something Grandpa apparently told you," he said. "About appearances being deceiving, but ownership being truth." I nodded, wondering where his thoughts were leading. "I think I finally understand what he meant," Michael continued. "Not legal ownership of property, but owning your choices, your values, your authentic path rather than one dictated by others' expectations." He raised his glass slightly. "To owning truth rather than maintaining appearances." The simple toast encapsulated the profound transformation of recent months, from a relationship built on misconceptions and dismissal to one founded on genuine recognition and shared values. Later that evening, as guests began to depart and the celebration quieted, I found myself alone in the cabin's kitchen, washing dishes alongside Vanessa's mother, Patricia, a woman who had initially intimidated me with her polished society demeanor, but who had shown unexpected depth throughout the eye. You created something remarkable here, she said quietly, her hands immersed in soapy water beside mine. Not just the beautiful setting, but the values it represents. Values I had almost forgotten were important. The cabin did that, I replied. My father's craftsmanship has a way of reminding people what matters. She shook her head slightly. No, Eleanor, you did that. By preserving this place when it would have been easier to let it go. By maintaining these values when the world increasingly dismissed them as outdated. By standing your ground when excluded from your son's wedding. She met my eyes directly. That kind of quiet courage changes more than just your own story. It creates ripples that affect everyone around you. As I prepared to leave the following morning, watching Michael and Vanessa begin their married life in the cabin that would now serve as their honeymoon retreat, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past 3 months. What had begun with the painful discovery of my exclusion from their wedding had transformed into a profound reconciliation that extended beyond my relationship with Michael to touch multiple lives. The cabin that had remained my secret sanctuary for 40 years had emerged from the shadows to become something more significant, a physical reminder of values worth preserving across generations. My son, who had dismissed me as financially naive and limited, had discovered not only my capabilities but wisdom he now actively sought. His wife, whom I had misjudged as superficially status-conscious, had revealed depths of perception and courage I hadn't imagined possible. Even Richard, though still firmly anchored in his world of status and strategic advantage, had been forced to recognize dimensions of my character he had conveniently minimized in his narrative of our relationship. The property he had dismissed as worthless except for the land it sits on had become the setting for his son's wedding, a tangible repudiation of the values hierarchy he had constructed. As I drove away from Pine Ridge that morning, leaving the young couple to begin their marriage in a place built with intention and maintained with devotion, I felt a sense of completion that transcended the specific outcomes of recent months. The cabin I had preserved through decades of quiet determination had ultimately preserved something in all of us. A recognition of what endures when appearances fade and strategic advantages lose their luster. My son's wife had told me I couldn't attend their wedding, so I canceled something they never expected. In doing so, I hadn't just protected a physical legacy, but had catalyzed a transformation in multiple lives, including my own. What had begun as a defensive revelation had evolved into an affirmative statement of values worth preserving, not just in physical structures, but in the relationships and choices that ultimately define our lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.